recording is starting up. Almost forgot that one, but the recording is going. Just so you know, and it's part of Plastic Free July and also the Breakthrough from Plastic Asia Pacific campaign, False Solutions Exposed, busting myths and unveiling false solutions to plastic pollution, as well as real solutions, which is where reuse comes in. At the end of Plastic Free July, we wanted to highlight real solutions. Yeah, so feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It's being recorded. More importantly, today we'll be learning from the iconic and the one and only Hannah Blumhardt. Where to even start with Hannah? She's omnipresent in the zero waste and plastic pollution space. She's cracking up because it's true, and involved in so many co-papa. There's of course a rubbish trip through which Hannah and her partner Liam Prince provide zero waste education, including a bunch of great DIY recipes and resources on their website, so you should go check that out. They've also just casually lived without a rubbish bin since 2015, which is pretty iconic behavior. 8 years without a bin. Hannah is also a prominent researcher involved with the Zero Waste Network and Victoria University based in Wellington. Hannah's professional background is in law and policy, and she has published so much of her great research on product stewardship and other policies around waste, as well as, of course, the potential of reuse systems to massively reduce the waste in our current economic system. She's been part of advisory groups for the Ministry for the Environment, including the update of the New Zealand waste strategy and the design of a beverage container return scheme for New Zealand. If that wasn't enough to convince you that Hannah is the expert that we need to show the power of reuse, she's also the co-founder and lead researcher of Reuse Aotearoa. She's the coordinator of the NZ Product Stewardship Council and the co-founder and policy spokesperson for Takeaway Throwaways. So with that massive CV in mind, I'll pass over to Hannah, who's zooming in from Hopper Refillery in Wellington. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa, can you all hear me? Awesome. Just letting you know that I am in Hopper, and so if you can hear some stuff in the background, that's people, but we'll just roll with that. I'm so stoked to be here. I'm so stoked to have been invited to contribute this kōrero to the False Solutions Exposed Break Free from Plastics campaign in the Asia Pacific. And I'm really excited to see so many of you here on a Friday afternoon. So thank you. And thank you so much to Matt for that introduction. I feel extremely embarrassed, especially about being omnipresent, because it's can't escape. So where to begin? What I wanted to say is that usually I like to make slides and talk, and everything's neatly tied up in a bow, and I feel all safe and secure with that security blanket. However, I've had sort of a lot on at the moment, and I did not have time to create slides. And so what I did is I frazzled Matt and made him rechange the meeting settings so that instead of this thing where you come into a webinar and it's just the video and you can't speak and you can't chat, I've asked to change those settings so that we can do this as a discussion, which is also why we have glorious unmuted sounds from participants. So I hope that you won't be too traumatized by the fact that I've decided to run this as a discussion-based session as opposed to everyone silently listening and nodding along. So it will work really well if we have a little bit of discussion, but if not, I'll ask rhetorical questions and then I'll answer them like a robot, and I might also draw in Matt. And I see that Liam is in the audience too, my partner, so he might have to put down his composting shovel and answer some questions if no one else pro-offers. All right, so we're talking about false solutions and real solutions to plastic pollution, but I really wanted to start by putting it out there to you as a group, and please just feel free to turn on your mic and put forward a suggestion, or if you want to type it into the chat. I really want to know what it is that first comes to your mind when you hear the term plastic pollution. And I'd love someone to break the ice by going first. What do we think of when we hear the term plastic pollution?
The first thing I think about when I think about plastic pollution, hello everybody, I'm Sarah Ann. from the Tarangatiri Council. I'm a waste officer there. I manage the ResourceWise program. But when we think about plastic solution, the first thing that I think of is how it's permeating everything, how it's in our soil, in our water, around us, and, you know, the scary kind of narrative that's out there that, you know, it could, you know, create cancer and everything. So plastic pollution to me is how it's infiltrated our daily lives and also into areas that we don't necessarily always think about. You know, you see the plastic dump there, you know, you're recycling your plastics or doing things with it, but to me the real pollution or the real problem lies in the things that we don't see. So that's my 2 cents.
Awesome. What a great way to start it off. And thank you for introducing yourself. It'd be great if more people could do that. Before the next person, Matt, would you be willing to read out anything that comes through in the chat?
Sure, yeah. So we've had a couple of responses to your question from Colette Davies. They've answered the ocean is the first thing that comes to mind when thinking of plastic pollution, which I think is very common for us here in Aotearoa and throughout Anuiakiwa. And Mia Salazar has also said that ocean animals getting tangled up and injured or killed by plastic pollution. It's the first thing she thinks of.
Cool. Did anyone else, any other brave soul, want to turn on their mic and suggest anything else they think of when they hear the term plastic pollution?
Maverick, come here. Maverick, stay here.
Can I say, I'm from Rethink Waste Manawatu. I think of the marine gyres and just the tragedy of, you know, microplastics being found intracellularly in fish, and that we and other organisms are eating this plastic because we can't detach it from our food.
Cool. Thank you to all of you who've shared that, and some really profound things coming through. And I, you know, from what Sarah Ann said too about permeating everything, and this not the things we see, but also the things we don't see. And yeah, and Sue, you tying that up with talking about it ending up in the food chain. So I think the first thing I want to point out is I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with the theory of planetary boundaries, but this is an idea that there are 12 key indicators of safe operating activities for that the planet needs to stay within in order to maintain a safe operating space for humanity. So things like biodiversity, climate change, and yeah, there's a number of them. So one of them is novel entities. So novel entities are basically anything that is geologically new to the planet, so synthetic things. So this planetary boundary had not been calculated until last year. And when it was calculated, what was found was that humanity is in very dangerous, very high levels of overshoot for novel entities. And this is predominantly because of plastic pollution. But not just plastic pollution, also chemical pollution, but many of these chemicals are actually additives that are added to plastics, not all of them, but many. So this idea of it permeating everything, being everywhere, affecting the planet on a systemic level, and not just being what we can see, but also we can't see, is very, very on point. So if you haven't heard of planetary boundaries theory and novel entities, look that up. But the other reason I wanted to ask this question is because often when you hear the terms plastic pollution discussed in the media or on social media or online, what often comes up is the impacts of plastic waste. So plastic in the ocean, plastic that's, you know, like the straw up the turtle's nose, harming wildlife, all of that kind of thing. And obviously that is really horrific and is one of the key contributors to the overshoot of the novel entities planetary boundary. But what's also important to recognize is it's only one aspect of plastic pollution. So the key thing to know about plastic pollution is that plastic pollutes at every stage of its lifespan. So I'm sure most of you know that plastic is, well, the overwhelming majority of plastic is made from fossil derived sources, right? Fossil fuels. And so to extract fossil fuels, we already know the extraction of oil is incredibly resource intensive. It can be very polluting. And then to turn oil into, base materials for plastic, it needs to be refined, which is also a polluting process. And both extraction and refining also have environmental justice implications for frontline communities that are close to where these things are happening, pipelines to get oil from places, all of that kind of thing. So that's the first part of the lifespan. Then to make plastic isn't just one thing, right? There's all these different kinds of plastic that perform all these different functions. They might be see-through, they might be hard, they might be soft, they might be used for packaging, they might be used for car parts, etc., etc. To turn oil into all these different types of plastic, different chemical additives need to be added. And so these chemical additives, we're talking tens of thousands of potential additives. Some of them we know are harmful. Some of them are safe. Some of them are harmful only in certain quantities. Some of them we don't know. We actually don't know if they're used or not, and we don't know whether they are safe or not. All of these additives can potentially leach. Well, the manufacture of them can be polluting, but they can also leach from plastics during their use phase. So what this means is that during the use phase of plastics, we may also be seeing pollution from these when we heat the plastic, for example, when we expose it to certain things like acids or oils all along the way. Another question, does anyone else know another way in which plastic can pollute while it is a product that is being used? What is another way that plastic products can pollute during their use phase other than leaching additives? No, I know. Pardon, what was that?
Through the PFAS chemicals, like if you heat up the plastic with food in it and stuff like that.
Yep, additives can when you heat things up. Yep, or when yeah. Another way is that products can just shed microplastics while they're in use, much before they become waste. So I'm not sure if anyone knows what the #1 source of microplastics into the environment from shedding from a product during a use is.
Is it tires?
Artificial lawn?
Clothes, washing clothes.
Yeah, great. Okay, so tires is said to be the #1 source. And then closely followed by textiles. Yeah, so clothes. And that's not just when you're washing them, it's also just when you're wearing them, shedding them. Carpets is another one that's very topical in New Zealand at the moment. And yes, with the rate of growth of astroturf, I can only imagine that would be a source that is very significant as well. Right, so we haven't even got, we've still got quite a lot of potential pollution. We haven't even got to plastic waste yet, right? So when we get to, let's say a product's reached the end of its life and we actually decide to recycle it, not dispose of it or not throw it into the ocean, like David Seymour doesn't do with his plastic bags. So if we recycle them, does anyone know anything about plastic recycling or heard anything recently in the news about plastic recycling?
Oh,
Yeah.
Dave Malcolm has his hand up. Go ahead, Dave. Typed in the chat, micro and nanoplastics.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Yeah, micro and nanoplastics through wastewater and emissions. There was that research that was just done in Scotland that that's what's happening. So yeah, recycling plastic is pollution.
Yeah, that's right. There is a risk of, because you often need to wash plastic, you need to flake plastics or pelletize it, and then you need to wash it often. And in that process, you can end up shedding microplastics, so bits of plastics go down the grating. And actually pellets is actually also a pre-production source of plastic into the environment that I forgot to mention. Anyway, we'll just put that one to one side. So yes, there is also evidence that plastics can pollute when they're recycled due to just inevitable escapage. And Also, there is research coming out that is showing that recycled plastic often has higher levels of toxicity. It's releasing more of those additives than virgin plastic as well. Okay, and then we get to waste, which is once it's become rubbish, it might escape into the environment, or possibly, controversial statement, if it ends up in landfill, that might be the safest place for that plastic, which is hardly a good outcome. All right, so we've discussed, when we think about it from this perspective, when we think about the full totality of how plastic can pollute, what does that sort of seem to indicate about the steps that we need to take to end plastic pollution? Like, clearly cleaning up beaches isn't going to stop the pollution that comes from extracting oil. But yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts about some steps that we would need to take to have a holistic approach to ending plastic pollution, or at least mitigating it significantly?
Well, I suppose it needs to start at procurement and looking at other options of packaging things. Although plastic, I mean, revolutionized how people are able to package their products and things. I mean, before everything was in glass and other things, I suppose, before plastics became as prevalent as it is now. So maybe just look back at what grandma did.
Right, so we've got, look at procurement, alternative materials or systems. I saw Sophia posted something in the chat, it was already whizzed past. Matt, are you able to chuck in anything that people have said in the chat on this question?
Sure, yeah, I'm not sure if Sophia, you wanted to mention your part in the discussion, but you mentioned education, changing our mindset and behavior, and Dave also mentioned toxic chemical here as well.
Yeah, so in terms of mindset and education, what would be the goal? What would we be wanting people or businesses to do instead?
I guess not everyone knows like that this is a thing. So first of all, we need to educate people, like information. Knowledge is power. And then after that, I guess we need to look at alternatives. And I mean, there are alternatives out there, right? I don't know. I feel that without the information, the change is not really possible. I don't know. That's my take.
Yeah. Awesome.
We need to stop using single use, and we need to go reuse, refill.
Okay, stop using single use, reuse, refill. And then Dave, your point around toxic chemicals, is that in terms of just not using them?
Sorry, that was related to what we were talking about earlier. I was just a bit slow on the game there, apologies.
That's all right. I'm just going to give that to you as let's try and phase out toxic chemicals as well. So that would be... so that would be, redesigning production as well. So yeah, going upstream. I think, does anyone else have anything burning comment they want to add before I tell you what I wanted to say? Everyone's like, no, don't do that to us. Okay, so what I wanted to say was, I think when you understand plastic pollution in its totality, what becomes very clear is that if we only focus on plastic pollution as a downstream problem of plastic waste, we tend to get focused on downstream solutions such as recycling more, cleaning up when there's a mess, potentially looking at things like compostables, all that kind of stuff. But if you understand that there are also upstream consequences, what that means is we also need to think about redesigning products in such a way that they are less likely to shed additives or microplastics during their usage. So that's where we start to talk about safe products and the safe circular economy, which is a big conversation for the plastics treaty. And if we go even further up, if we want to stop the impact of extracting oil, then logically what that means is that we need to use less plastic. So we need systems for using less plastic. And I can see that Prashanti has said compostables are not a solution, and that is true, and we can talk about why that is soon, or you can go and have a listen to Liam's webinar from last week. So, and in terms of education, where that would fit in, I'm thinking about, well, how do we talk about plastic pollution in a more holistic way, but also talk about solutions in a more holistic way, and start to really brainstorm and think about, okay, if we're deciding we want to tackle the pollution that's centered around extraction of oil, what solutions are going to help with that? What solutions are going to help with toxicity? What solutions are going to help with microplastic shedding, and so on? Okay, so let's say that we want to focus on turning off the tap, though. You might have heard this concept of turning off the tap. What I feel is useful to know, if we want to turn off the tap, is we really need to know what are the biggest uses of plastic, because then we can start to tackle them by product or sector. So my question to you is, does anyone know which product type, which sector is the biggest user of plastic? Seeing head shaking, does anyone want to, either if you know or if you want to guess?
Is it single-use beverages?
It's connected to that, and connected to what Nicola just put in the chat. So the biggest usage of plastic globally is packaging. So not just beverage containers, but packaging. Packaging for all range of sectors. So 36% of all the plastic made globally is turned into packaging. And that is by far the biggest market share. So it's not the majority of plastic, but it's by far the biggest chunk. Bigger than textiles, bigger than construction, bigger than durable goods, bigger than vehicles. It's packaging is the biggest user. So what that means is that if we're thinking about trying to turn off the tap in relation to the biggest user of plastics, what that means is that we need to be thinking about how can we reduce the amount of plastic packaging, basically. And that's kind of where I've come to in my thinking is, that's where I think about putting my energy. So my last set of questions to you, and we're well on track for us to finish this discussion, and then I'm going to take you around the shop. But I want to hear from you. If you were put in charge of coming up with a plan to reduce the amount of plastic packaging in the world, what are some actions you could take?
I don't know. What about making it like bulk buying more feasible? I find like for us, we do a lot of baking and a lot of our products are in plastic, but they're cheaper to buy from the supermarket than they are from bulk bin stores.
Cool, that got very specific very fast. So if we just step back from that, but that's good. So one of the ways to support a reduction in plastic packaging is to use larger packaging sizes and allow people to get products without packaging in the first place through refill. So bulk packaging systems and refill packaging systems. Yep. Can someone explain how bulk and refill connects to a reduction in plastic packaging?
Yeah, well, ultimately, you're still using plastics, not using.
Sorry, I missed that.
While you're still using plastics, you're not using anywhere as the same amount in a bulk buy. Or say using something bin, they're still using sacks and filling their bins, but the individual consumer can come in and reuse a reusable container. So there's still plastic involved in the process, but nowhere near as much.
Yeah, okay, so bulk packaging systems, and you're also in the process encouraging people to refill, which is a zero packaging system as well, depending on whether you're the business or the consumer. Cool. All right. Any other ideas? We've gone straight to bulk, but are there any other thoughts about, like, if you stopped the average person in the street and said, let's use less plastic packaging. What are they going to suggest you do instead?
Stop consumption.
Pardon?
Stop consumption.
Oh, yeah, so we could just stop buying things.
What about changing our expectation of how long a product should last? Like not needing packaging that will make it last for 3 years if we reasonably should eat it within a month or so.
Yeah. Yep, that's a really good point, because often you hear this thing about how, well, if we switch away from plastic packaging, we'll have more food waste because plastic packaging protects food. So there's a whole debate around that. But even if you take that on face value, it's like, well, if you're thinking about it in the terms of we've just got to have these just-in-time models, oversupply of fresh food, out of season, all of that kind of stuff. And maybe if we change our buying practices and our expectations, we're not going to have the food waste, and we also won't have all the packaging waste. So yeah, great idea. What about, I see Prashanti in the chat was also saying growing hue, which traditional, well, we're used as traditional water carriers across the Pacific Islands and in Aotearoa as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Prashanti?
Yeah, I'm in a bit of a hue buzz at the moment.
They're
also actually used traditionally for fermenting food and carrying food as well. So yeah, we could use them for a ladle if you cut them and preserve them in a different way. Yeah, I think growing our own food and harvesting it, baking our own bread instead of buying it in plastic. There's lots of ways we can minimize our footprint through not consuming plastic. I have a jar collection that I'm in love with, and I know you have your one too, Hannah. Yeah, so get into jars instead of plastic bags.
I'm about to show some pretty impressive jar collections here too as well. So yeah, great, awesome, thank you. So tapping into not only what people are talking about overseas, but also locally in Aotearoa in the Pacific, there are local alternatives to plastic that have a long history, and we should be tapping into those as well, because it's really important knowledge. Okay, so we had a range of things. Now, one thing I was interested in is that no one has said, well, just buy products in paper or in glass or buy cans instead of plastic bottles, or so why would that not necessarily be something that people have said?
Because it might just create other problems. If you don't reuse what you have, you're still gonna create single-use products that need to get to their end of their life and go somewhere.
Yeah, all packaging is resource consumption.
Yeah, that's right. If we're thinking about plastic across its full lifespan, right? The impacts of extracting the oil, well, you've got those impacts from cutting down trees, you've got those impacts from mining silica sand for glass, you've got those impacts from mining bauxite for aluminium. And while you can recycle products, lots of products are not infinitely recyclable back into themselves. And so if they're not recyclable back into themselves, that means that if we want more of that single-use packaging, we've still got to go do the extraction. So yeah, that's good. Someone else was going to say something and I cut across them, sorry.
Cost is also a barrier to the average consumer. Plastics are generally cheaper than the glass or metal alternatives. You often like soft drinks, not encouraging people to drink drinks, but cost is sometimes 5 times as much based on the volume.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And this also links into what Sarah said before around making bulk more accessible. Does anyone know why people used to buy in bulk before, back in the day?
Because it was the only option they had?
Yeah, it was the only option because it was the only way that supply chain issues, that's right, Prashanti, it was the cheapest way for businesses to get goods to consumers. So if you look if you also look in, for example, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia right now are dealing with a whole stream of plastic waste that we don't see that much in New Zealand, which is sachet waste. But bearing in mind as well that this is not just a session for New Zealanders, it's a session for the Asia Pacific. But yeah, sachet waste. Now these sachets are basically ways of selling small amounts of product like shampoo, cleaning products, small amounts of condiments, all that kind of stuff, because it's cheaper for people to buy that amount, and they might not be able to buy up front, you know, a bottle of shampoo or whatever. This way of selling products, sachets, displace the way that people used to buy small quantities of food, which was in bulk. So the thing about bulk refill vending systems, not your co-op where you buy a 20 kg sack between 10 people, but shops that can buy up front, is that it actually gives consumers the ability to buy just what they need and to control their spending. So this idea that bulk should be more expensive is actually not the history of bulk buying has not always been that way. So yeah, so part of the reason it's cheaper is because we don't factor in the true cost of single-use packaging. It's part of the reason single-use packaging is cheaper, sorry. So we're still paying, it's just we're paying as a society, and future generations are paying. And okay, cool. So basically, to sum up, we've got, if we want to reduce packaging, plastic packaging, what we don't want to do is replace with single-use packaging of something else, because it can create more problems. They might not be the same problems, but more different problems. Compostables are not a solution for other reasons as well, because we don't feel good about putting them in the soil, apart from other things. So we really need to be looking at alternative systems, instead of single use, doing reuse. So there are different ways that you can do a reuse system. Some options are selling in bulk, and then people bring their own containers to fill, or packaging into containers that suppliers will accept back for sterilization and refill. So, you know, like your milk bottle schemes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce you to Hopper. So Hopper is one of the zero waste grocers in Wellington, and I'm going to show you some of these reuse systems in action, because I think it's really important to see them and then understand the waste reduction potential from seeing them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on, and please, if you want to interrupt at any point, feel free. The shop is open, so there are people here. Just let me know if you're having hearing issues. I'm just going to start with where I start. So firstly, we've got cleaning products. So these are cleaning products. You can buy pre-made ones, or you can buy ingredients. What's cool is they come in a bulk container, so you're avoiding all of these little containers, and you can refill your own. And this is 20 litres. So instead of 40 500ml bottles, you've got just one container. And what's cool is that this is Figgy & Co. So the store works with this company, and when this is empty, it goes back to Figgy & Co. and they refill it and then send it back. So we've got, as it's not just the front of house, it's the back of house reuse system as well. So you might forget your own containers. And so what often people do, if it's another type of store, is that they will just buy a single-use container to fill, or if they're filling from a bulk bin, which I'll show you in a minute, they'll use a brown paper bag. What Hopper does is they get people to donate their jars. They put them through a sanitizer, and you can take these for free. See, free jars. And they charge you if you want to use a paper bag. So that's good. Cool. So this is another system that I think is really cool. This here, just wait for it. This is the holy grail of zero waste success. Does anyone know what that is? It's tofu, that's right. So this tofu is made just up the road by a company who packs into that 4-hopper see that is cheese, which is made also local in New Zealand, all New Zealand cheese. It arrives unpackaged. So those are some ways that you can sell things unpackaged. And then we're talking about the reuse swap system. So we've got fizzy drinks here, kombucha here, and we have milk down here. These are all made locally, and they're put into glass bottles. And when customers finish with them, bring them back to Hopper. They go down here, they're sorted, and then they're given back to the suppliers and they get sanitized and reused. So a bottle like that could go around the system theoretically 200 times. And so that's 200 plastic bottles or 100 2-litre milk bottles that never had to be created. For the oils, we've got a similar system in bulk. Some of these, so this one arrives in a container that goes back to the local olive oil grower, but some do come in disposable packaging. So the supply chain isn't fully zero waste, but you can see that Hopper is trying to work on it. Got other companies like Apostle that is local. They take all of their hot sauce bottles back, sanitize and refill them. And again, Hopper is a drop-off point for them. And then we get to the bulk bins, of which Hopper tries to fill as many as they can through local suppliers who will take their containers back and refill them. Here's an example here is honey that goes between the supplier and Hopper, as well as the hemp seed oil, people that use that. So yeah, then they've got all the spices, same deal, and they're transparent as well about the stuff that comes in packaging. So they don't, they don't pretend that it all magically floats into the bins. But what you can see is that once you start to identify this supply chain waste, you can start to chip away at reducing it. Yeah, and so what you can also probably start to see is that it's much easier for Hopper to reduce waste if they're working with local suppliers. So, for example, their quinoa is from New Zealand. Most of the flours are from New Zealand. The lentils are from New Zealand. So what's awesome about reuse is not only the fact that you're reducing waste, but it kind of goes back to what Sue was saying before around expectations, like this idea that we can just import stuff from all over the world, or that things are always going to be available when we want them, pre-made, all of that kind of stuff. These are things that have been made possible by single-use packaging. And so you can only go so far in eliminating single-use packaging if we continue the means of consumption that we're used to that have been purely made possible because of single use. And so when you're trying to think about reducing supply chain waste, Hopper works with local suppliers because it's easier then to do the exchange of the containers. One example I really like of this is Solid. Has anyone here heard of Solid? Solid is a New Zealand toothpaste company started by a manufacturer, a dental hygienist. So what they do is, firstly, they do toothpaste tabs, which you can just buy in bulk, or you can buy them in a glass jar. And they also do toothpaste in a more traditional liquidy format, how it comes out of the tube. And they do mouthwash, and they've also started whitener as well. All of their packaging they take back, they sanitize and they refill. So again, a zero waste toothpaste supply chain. And they also have, Hopper doesn't have it, but just down the road, they've retrofitted a sausage machine that dispenses the liquid toothpaste on tap. It is literally the first toothpaste dispensing machine on the planet that they know of. So yeah, these are the kinds of things that become possible when you start to think about outside the box a little bit. I think those are possibly all of the, there's a couple of other things as well, like obviously, just working with egg suppliers to sell the eggs, and then they collect the cartons and they all go back to the supplier. Another thing they do is bread. So they'll collect bread from a local bakery that it's like day-old bread that they can't sell, would otherwise go to landfill, and Hopper gets that bread and sells it for like a quarter of the price, and it's bougie sourdough bread as well. So yeah, I think that's probably the main examples. So I guess if anybody has any questions that they'd like to share, and I think one of the things I want to do, having just shown around the shop, is to say that I still want to acknowledge what Sarah and I think Dave said around making these things affordable, which is obviously really important, because no point having a real awesome system if people can't afford to shop there. And I guess that's what the bigger picture purpose of this webinar is, that if we get a proper grip on what the scale of the plastic pollution problem is, a proper understanding of the solutions, and if we don't get distracted by false solutions, what that means is we start to build the expectations and also the mandate for governments to start regulating properly in this space, and for councils to start investing in more reuse infrastructure rather than just recycling infrastructure. And we also start to build a public mandate for businesses to adopt these business models. So every second that we don't spend being distracted by compostable packaging and all of that kind of stuff is an extra second that we can spend talking and thinking about the reuse system. The other thing I want to say is that given how next level this type of store is, it's actually surprising how affordable it is given the extent to which it's pushing against the system. And what that says to me is that actually it wouldn't take a lot of government intervention to rebalance the system in favor of reuse a little bit more. Like it's actually not rocket science. And so I think those are two really important things. And so the point of showing all of this isn't to make you feel guilty if you're not shopping in places like this. That's not the point at all. It's to show you what's possible, to show you that when we're talking about reuse, we are talking about real life things that really are happening. We're not talking about fancy tech that needs to be invented. It already exists. And so I'm hoping that you'll leave feeling optimistic rather than too overwhelmed. But I think that's all that I have to say, really. So I'm happy to just take questions.
We've had a few roll in, Hannah. I'm not sure if people want to ask their questions themselves. Sorry, Liam's got one. He said to put down his compost shovel, so maybe he can't put his camera on for this one. But please, Liam, if you want to, the floor is yours. Nah, maybe not. He said,
sorry, I'm here. I was just putting my my gloves back on to pick up the shovel again, but I just wondered about a lot of the bulk containers are made with plastic too, and of course they're reusable, but if we wanted to shift away from even those types of plastic, are there alternatives out there for, you know, larger bulk containers, different materials and systems?
Some great question, Liam. Yes, and in fact, I should show you one of them, which I didn't get to show you before. I just got distracted. But who's heard of kegs? Actually, a really normal reuse system, you know, kegs are really normal in the beverage sector. So this is a company that actually packs into kegs for their cleaning products. It's an innovative, probably one of the only companies I know of that puts cleaning products into kegs instead of plastic jerry cans. And yeah, and then, you know, your classic glass bottle swap systems are already glass. But you can also see in terms of bulk bins, There are other dispensing methods, such as if you've got, you know, lots of, there's glass, these are big glass jars you probably can't see to scale, but they're like, you know, not teeny ones. And then of course, you can also have these metal cans. So yeah, and then for the bread, that's all on, you know, this wooden thing, although they do come in that plastic container. So yeah, there's a lot of work still, even within the reusable supply chain, to reduce plastic usage. And that's certainly something that's come up in the international conversations around moving away from plastic, is if we understand plastic pollution in its totality, then what that means is that reuse on its own isn't necessarily enough. We also need to be thinking about safe reuse systems. And so wherever we can, if we can incorporate, try and true systems like wood, metal for stainless steel kegs, glass for storing things. And overseas, in terms of bulk dispensing systems, it's much more common to see glass bulk bins, but in New Zealand, that's not so common. So yeah, definitely work to do there. Thanks, Liam.
Hey, Hannah, Sophia also asked before what the name of that drink company was that you showed.
Which one?
I think it was at the start of your...
The ones that they are reusing the bottles? Kombucha?
Yeah, there's actually 4 there. So there's KB Kombucha, and they also sell on tap as well in their shops. There's Hardy Boys, which is the fizzy drinks. Who are actually me and Liam's landlords, lol. And then the other ginger beer is a Kawakawa ginger beer, and that's made by Peacock's Tail. And then the milk is Ekatahuna milk. So yeah, KB Kombucha, Hardy Boys, Peacock's Tail, and Ekatahuna. But what's interesting and I think important to note is, for example, Hardy Boys, they don't ship outside of Wellington. So that's the other thing, is that lots of these companies who do reuse, they're local, because again, if you want to take over the world with your business model, it's hard to do that without single-use plastic unless you're ginormous. So yeah, it's also about looking at what's local to you.
Not sure if you can see the chat, Hannah, but Sophia's just mentioned that they work in an organic store with bulk bins, reuse systems, but all the vegetables come in plastic bags. And not sure about other alternatives to keep them fresh.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in the supermarket supply chain, most vegetables come to supermarkets in reusable produce crates run by either CHEP or Loscam, I think is the other company. So yeah, and again, that's a question of scale. They've got such big scale that they can go from producers to supermarkets with this, you know, they've got fleets of millions of reusable crates. So yeah, definitely don't need plastic packaging to keep organic produce fresh. And I think there's conversations there to be had around at what point do you stop being organic if you're packaging in plastic, given what we've already discussed around you know, additives and plastics. That's not something I have an answer to. I'm just saying I think it's a good conversation to be having.
Awesome, thanks, Hannah. We've got about 9 minutes left. I'm not sure if anyone wants to ask any questions. Feel free to put your mic on. Just straight ask it to Hannah. But Hannah, was there anything we need to save time for at the end?
No, I guess I do just want to say, like, when I'm talking about this whole time and talking about pollution from plastics, I'm necessarily speaking in a very generic sense, and there's huge multiplicity in plastics as well as plastic packaging, and so we just don't know what's in half of the products. We can't say that there's going to be something, you know, like it's just not the case that necessarily all plastics are going to be equal levels of toxicity or any toxicity. We don't know. And so I think it's really important, just what I'm saying just is necessarily generic, and for each individual product, you know, you have to assess it on its own terms. But just as a general rule, there isn't a lot of transparency in terms of how packaging is made, so it's quite difficult to assess or have these conversations. But we certainly know in terms of recycling and microplastic shedding that it's pretty hard to stop that, and it's pretty hard to have end-to-end 100% recycled content in most plastic packaging.
Go for it, Liam.
Thank you, kia ora. Hannah, I wondered if you could talk about some interesting examples of reuse outside of the packaging and grocery space, because you know, as you mentioned, packaging is the major use of plastic, but plastics are in all sorts of other things, other industries.
Reusables.
Yeah, reusable. Yeah, in other industries.
Yeah. There are lots of different models, like especially in the business-to-business space. Pallets are a good example of reusable pallets that can be made of wood, that can be used across industries. Overseas, there are some companies looking at reusable courier satchels for e-commerce sales. Trying to think of some other, you know, in industrial manufacturing lines, you might have reusable packaging bringing components to production lines. There are companies trying to look at how to get rid of shrink wrap, trying to set up reusable pallet wraps, and that's difficult, but you know, fish bins and meat processing, you might have lots of behind the scenes systems for that. Even just like when you're thinking about garden supplies or landscaping supplies, lots of companies may sell those things in bulk without packaging. You go bring a trailer, or can deliver bulk quantities. So yeah, there's a lot of multiplicity, and so reuse systems can involve, you know, packaging that goes back and forth, or it can also involve, you know, like bulk packaging that gets moved back and forth, and so things are delivered unpackaged. And there are lots of examples in other industries. But having said all that, most commonly, if it's a reusable package, it will be plastic. Yeah, that's kind of how it is at the moment. But I think reuse as a system is important to consider regardless of the material that's being used, especially if you are overall reducing the quantity of packaging, you're still achieving a reduction in plastic packaging. And you're also decreasing the surface area of product in contact with packaging. So yeah. Hope that answers your question to some extent.
Hannah, what about shoes? They seem to be mainly plastic these days, and I find it quite a dilemma. Like even the slippers I'm wearing, they're lovely wool felt uppers, but the bottoms of them are plastic.
Yeah, shoes are not my area of expertise. But in terms of reuse, generally, when we're talking about durable products, wherever possible, good to extend their life. So the longer a product lives, the fewer times you need to replace it, which means less manufacturing, less extraction of raw materials. And so thinking about cobblers for repair and that kind of thing. But in terms of during the use phase, when you're walking and then it's friction, it's shedding microplastics onto the pavements, yeah, I don't have a lot of answers to that. And most of the compostable shoes that I've seen still incorporate synthetic additives, as far as I can tell. Like, yeah, so sorry, I don't have anything useful to say there, other than the best that I think I can think of is just keeping your shoes repaired so that they last longer and buying secondhand when you can.
Any more questions in our last couple minutes? Please feel free to just jump on the mic.
Hannah, I guess my question is, how do we do behavior change with the masses, you know, like we're just a small group of people all doing our little bit that we can do, but how do we get like population scale, how do we upscale this movement to really make the difference that we need to make in the world?
Having lived without a bin for 8 years and also done a lot of work in terms of supporting communities, doing talks around zero waste living, creating shopping guides to support people, talking with businesses, government. My feeling is that right now, living low waste or engaging with reuse systems requires you to go against the grain of how society is set up. And it is unreasonable for us as individuals and councils and also government to be asking people to go against the grain and behave in a way that goes against how the system is set up. And so my feeling is, particularly when government does behaviour change campaigns, I get really het up about this, is that we shouldn't have to cajole people to behave differently to how the system is set up. We need to start changing the system. And more often than not, it comes down to the cost of doing things in one way or the other. And right now, it generally costs more to do reuse because the costs of single use are not internalized. And so single use, if companies had to pay for the full cost of single use, most of the time it would be more expensive than it is to run a reuse system. But right now they don't have to pay the full cost because councils collect waste and recycling. It's subsidized by the public. If it goes into the environment and it chokes a bird, it's the birds paying for it, not the company that put it on the market. Do companies go out and do cleanups of all their products? No, if they had to pay the costs of cleanup, it would be very expensive. So I know this is a really not satisfying answer, but we just have to keep bringing awareness to the fact that single use is subsidized and reuse is not. And we need to really push for policies that will change that. You know, things like the beverage container return scheme, such a simple way of starting to internalize the cost of single-use packaging, and it got put on the policy bonfire. It's very hard. That's been in the people have been campaigning for that for like 30 years in New Zealand. So it's really, really tricky. But in the meantime, yeah, I just encourage people to just keep talking. And if you have the means to be able to put your money towards businesses that are trying, like Hopper in Wellington, do it. Like I would say, prioritize it. If you're struggling, don't hold that on your shoulders as not an individual responsibility. But yeah, talking about these things and from a council perspective, I really encourage councils to think about the amount of money that is spent on waste and recycling systems, and that we need to correct the imbalance. If we're going to spend that much money on waste and recycling, we need to spend an equivalent amount on reuse. To even start to rebalance that subsidy that's going to disposables. So yeah, and people can advocate to their councils to do that, something we can do. So yeah, submitting to councils if you can on their waste management and minimisation plans. There's loads going through at the moment. Submitting to government, writing to go meet your local politician. Yeah, it's really, really hard work doing advocacy. But ultimately, I do believe that that's where the behaviour change is going to come from.
Cool, thank you so much for that. It's a long journey ahead, I think.
It is.
And thanks for the great questions, guys. We're at 4:02 now. I'm not sure if people haven't left yet, but we're still here. Hannah probably has stuff to do though. So just want to say a massive thank you from all of us to Hannah for all of your knowledge and expertise and everything you've shared with us today. Also, the chat has been going off with so many resources from Jackie Nunez, who came to our Upper Hui last year. Kia ora, Jackie. I'm not sure where you are, probably back in the US now. But yeah, lots of resources on plastic-free shoes, on plastic pellets, lots of links there as well. Jackie also put a link to an article about how recycling just creates more contamination and more microplastics and all that kind of stuff. I think Dave linked some stuff as well. But just pass back over to Hannah. Any last thoughts from you, Hannah? Thank you so much.
I just want to say two things. The first is that I was so worried that I was going to be talking into the ether and everyone was going to be too terrified to speak. And so I'm just blown away by how engaged everyone has been. I just want to thank you so much. And it just makes me feel basically really heartened that there are people out there that not only care about plastic pollution, but also really excited about reuse and want to talk about it and have all these ideas. So thank you so much for participating and running this webinar with me. And thank you to Matt for inviting me and for pulling it all together, and to Faye and Air for sorting out the text so that we could have a conversation instead of me talking at you. So yeah, thank you so much. And let's bring on the reuse revolution.
Kia ora, everyone. Bring on the reuse revolution.